Marty Herskovitz.
Luke Barber.
Thanks so much. It's great to have you here in the High Country, here at the annual Symposium with the Center for Judaic Holocaust and Peace Studies. And I guess just to start things off, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the symposium and just maybe what you think about these types of efforts to continue Holocaust education here in the state and to maybe improve on it with these types of workshops and opportunities for teachers.
Yes, I think it's vitally important. I think that a lot of the ideas and the materials for a Holocaust remembrance are 30, 40 years old, and it needs really to evolve. We've learned so much about trauma and about memory studies and brain studies that we know now a lot more than we used to, and so it's important that you have these symposiums every year and sort of bring the state-of-the-art teachers so that the teachers can be the best teachers as they can, because it's a very challenging area, the Holocaust studies, and so that you need these people to be updated with the best possible information, with the best pedagogy. Yeah.
Right. And I've been impressed, too, about the way that some of these teachers and presenters have been approaching the subject to kind of lend a lot of, maybe sensitivity to it, and just they recognize the heaviness, a lot of it. And I've been real impressed with the way they've been trying to incorporate that into the curriculum, with the understanding, like people myself, I think I took, when I was in high school, I had a Holocaust class specifically about the subject, and it was one of the most, if not the most impactful class I ever had when I was in high school. And I think that was probably one of the reasons why when I came to App State, I became very interested in the center and wanted to get involved with it. And it definitely had an impact on me.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that there was a tendency to be very heavy-handed and to use a lot of traumatic materials towards it. And what we're really realizing now is that if you go too much towards the trauma side, it causes the student to deflect and not be able to connect to the information. So that's the whole idea of using poetry and arts is to make it much more accessible and to use a language that is much more connecting and less traumatic.
Yeah, and I think as we had talked over the weekend, you're trying to take you're really trying to bring the human element into it, maybe move away a little bit from just the numbers or the political aspects of this period in history, but really it seems like what you're trying to do in your book is really, humanize it and using the medium of poetry to really bring this to life and show how it affects people, not just during that specific time frame, but how it has reverberations throughout the generations.
Yes.
Would you say that's more or less what you're
so
attempting to do?
I would like to read a poem. It's called Provinces, that deals with this, because a lot of the students who are here at the symposium, a lot of the teachers who are here at the symposium said that this was very relevant to them because they had just come back from a tour of Poland with Rabbi Gutman, and he had spent the whole time talking about the trauma and talking about all the terrible atrocities that had happened and all the terrible murders, and they liked that this poem Provinces dealt with more the more human side.
Yes.
So, Provinces. I went on a tour of the camps with Yad Vashem to the provinces of persecution. We visited 3 camps where the victims were murdered, and 4 camps in which they were not murdered but died from disease and starvation. We walked along the paths where they marched and died, and we visited forests where they lay in ditches and were shot. We visited towns with no Jews and synagogues without penitents. But in all these places, my family clung to life and planned a future that never came to be, exchanging recipes soon to be prepared that remained uncooked. They stood ramrod straight during roll call, so as not to be chosen. Even when weakened, they continued to dream dreams, to cling to life. as death drew closer. But we visited places with none of this vitality, merely the pallor of death. So I think that part of the reason I wrote this book was to bring a new language of Holocaust remembrance that talks about the vitality and the humanity and about the people.
Yes.
You know, because a lot of times you talk about the atrocities and you forget about the people.
Right. And even just something like in that poem where you're thinking about just the day-to-day thoughts that these people have, where they're making plans or thinking what they're going to eat for their next meal or what recipes to cook.
Yeah.
That's life. It's just kind of that mundane aspect day to day, and I think that's one of the way you're trying to capture in that poem. It's just like these are the thoughts that these people are having, not knowing that their fate was.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you talk about heroism. Mm-hmm. I mean, to be in the Holocaust and just try to continue day to day and try to survive is a type of heroism also. So you talk about the partisans and you talk about the Warsaw ghettos and the fighters, and there was a simple sort of heroism. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were families that could have split apart. I mean, sons could have left their parents alone and ran away, and they refused to because they couldn't imagine leaving their family to die alone. And so that's a sort of heroism,
Right.
So.
Yeah, just surviving. Because I think I was watching Shelley Wiener's presentation the other day, and there was that part of it where they're staying in this this farmhouse, and there was this family that took a chance to shelter them during that time period. And I think when you hear a lot of these stories, that type of heroism specifically, stands out in the midst of all that. But I really like what you're doing with highlighting that, just the mere act of surviving, just that day-to-day aspect during that time period is, enough in and of itself to recognize through these types of works.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the Warsaw Ghetto and you said, I could never be a Mordechai Anilevich. I could never, rise up and lead a revolution, and I think that there's a simple sort of heroism that is much more relevant to us. I mean, I'm not going to be one who's going to, storm the barricades, but there's a simple sort of heroism of speaking out and making yourself up, standing for what's right, without having to, take up arms or anything like that. That's important for us now also.
Yes. Yeah. How do you think the medium of poetry in and of itself really lends to this type of work? Or if I could phrase that a different way, like, why did you maybe choose poetry instead of like a different way of expression? Like, what was it that really stuck out in your mind that really connected with you?
I think, first of all, the material lends itself to poetry. It's something that needs a more emotional way of expressing yourself and not a more structured way. I mean, what I liked about poetry is that it has there's a lack of traditional structure, so that I didn't have to finish sentences because I couldn't finish the sentence. Sometimes I was so overcome that you could just say a few words and you can't, and it's good because you can also, I mean, with the Holocaust, it's important that you get your message across, as tersely and as compactly as possible, because people, after a while, they're not going to read a book of 250 pages with full the facts of the Holocaust. So if you can give them a page of poetry and tell them, okay, and get your point across, and that's what I love. Now, the other thing about poetry is that it's also its indirectness. I mean, I am a victim of trauma because I grew up in a family where my parents were emotionally damaged.
Yeah.
So it's not. I think that poetry is the only way I could have expressed a lot of the emotions that I wanted to speak about, a lot of the anger towards my family, and a lot of my pain. The poetry was the only way I could express it. It's something that you can't, it's like, it's an indirect way of talking about these things, because it's difficult to talk about your parents in a direct way and say, okay, you screwed me up, and it's not their fault at all, and I can't blame them because they went through, and it wasn't, their fault for what they went through, but it's still, in some ways, I suffered, but my suffering was like, you can't compare it. Their suffering was so much greater. So you're saying, someone was saying, kids saying, I didn't get, the peanut butter sandwich wasn't cut the way I wanted, That's not something to complain about, Or my mother didn't hug me and things like that. These are things that, you're saying, it's also pain. It's also feeling that people didn't see you and didn't pay attention to you. But it's nothing like a Holocaust or whatever. So it's a very sensitive sort of thing, how a second generation can express their pain, and how much right do we have to express our pain? Now, everyone has a right to express their pain or whatever, but if it takes away from the pain of my parents, or it detracts from what my parents happened to my parents, it's difficult. So the poetry allowed me to do that.
Well, I think in the foreword of the book, the person who wrote that, I think they explicitly, lay out the issue. This kind of conversation comes in contact with us sometimes with comparing traumas. Yes. And how people, look at these kinds of situations and say, okay, well, maybe these people's lives, or they suffered more due to the circumstances in this. But I think this is, particularly powerful, because whether or not it's Holocaust related or just different things that people go through in life, I think people can glean a lot from these kinds of works about the courage of confronting this and facing this and processing whatever trauma they have, because on the other side of that is ultimately a healthier life.
Yes.
And in my estimation.
Yeah. So, that's the whole point, is that I bring up these emotions because I feel that this was a way to heal. Yeah. And I'm hoping that via my story and my poetry, I can help other people confront their own pain and express their pain and perhaps heal also. Mm-hmm.
And the work is very personal, is very related to your family, the, culture you grew up in. I kind of like where, in different parts where you, use the metaphorical language to refer to some type of Jewish tradition. I like the asterisks because, growing up more of a Christian background, you get to, recognize, okay, this is what part of the Torah that this is referring to.
Yeah.
But if you could, I'd like to hear a little bit of just maybe about the story of your parents and what they experienced during that time period.
Okay. So my parents never spoke about the Holocaust or their experiences. Perhaps they would mention a story or two. They felt that they were protecting me by not talking about the Holocaust. But research has found that it's important to connect to it and to process it. You don't repress the trauma. That's not how you heal trauma. What you do is you bring it up in a controlled way and then process it. So my father's not actually a Holocaust survivor. And my mother and my father were born in 1924 in the same town. It was called Seredna. It was then Slovakia, but is now Ukraine. It's a small town between Munkachevo now, and Ungvar or Uzhgorod today, which is in Ukraine. And when my father was 5 years old, his family decided to go to America. So my grandfather took 3 of his children with him and his wife to America and left my father behind together with his brother, because they were 5 years old and they had started education, and there wasn't good Jewish education in America. It was still a relatively new religious community, so that there wasn't, he felt that he should stay in Europe where he already started learning. But it was an abandonment, and it affected his whole life. My mother, on the other hand, lived in Suredna until the Holocaust. The Holocaust started in 1939. The Hungarians started repressing, and there were the Nuremberg laws. They could not work, they could not own property, and so a lot of there was extreme poverty. But people somehow continued to survive. In 1943, Hitler deposed the Prime Minister of Hungary, and in 1944, he used the Arrow Cross troops in order to start the final solution. In Passover of 1944, the spring of 1944, my family, the Herskovitz family, so my great-grandfather was called Avram Herskovitz, and his wife was called Necha Herskovitz. They had 12 children, and so their oldest, Solomon, had gone away. That's my grandfather. But the rest of the family was around, so you had like 11 children. Of them, like 8 of them were already married with other children. And so there was this whole clan of Herskovitz family. And then my grandmother, who was married to Solomon, who was Stern, was also from the area. So a lot of this Stern family was taken away. So you had over 100 people who were taken to the ghetto in Ungvar. The ghetto was not actually because they were planning to ship them quickly to Auschwitz. It wasn't really a ghetto with houses and things like that. It was more of a brickyard in Ungvar. Because the bricks were near the train station, because it was heavy, it had to be next to the train tracks, and also it had wide open spaces, so they put all the Jews of Ungvar and the surrounding villages in the brick factory. This was in April 1944, and then in beginning of May 1944, everyone was taken to Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. And most of the family was taken immediately to, people who had families, women who had children with them, and people who were elderly, above 40, and were not in very good shape, or young children were automatically sent to the gas chambers at the selection process. And my mother and a lot of her sister and her aunts and her cousins were put in the third lager for waiting to be processed and where to be taken. And so they were there for 3 months. My mother and my sister, and they had an aunt who was around the same age. They were basically a trio, and so they were in August, they were seeing that things were going downhill. They were starving and they were thirsty, and they saw the disease around. They said, we have to volunteer. So in August of 1944, they volunteered, and they were taken to an Air Force base in a Luftwaffe base near Frankfurt, where the women prisoners were used in order to go out during the bombings and repair and after the bombings to repair the runways so that the planes could take off. And so quite a few of the women were killed during the work. And but then in November 1944, the Allied forces were approaching Frankfurt, so they had to evacuate them. They were taken to another work camp, and then finally to Ravensbrück, which was the women's prisoner camp, which had prisoners from all denominations, from just political prisoners and ideological prisoners. And so they were taken there in May of 1945, or April, I don't know exactly when. The Swedish Red Cross was able to ransom a good certain prisoners from that, and my mother was one of the prisoners ransomed. They were taken by the white buses, which we saw the other day, about the white buses to the German coast, and from there they were transferred to Sweden. My mother and her sister and her aunt were there for about a year, and then when they had rehabilitated a little bit, they were allowed to join their family, and their family was my father's father, who was their uncle or brother, and my aunt's brother, my great aunt's brother, and my mother and my sister and her sister's uncle. So they went to him. They weren't there for very long because they were treated very badly. They were treated as domestics. They were made fun of. And the only person who was really nice to them was my father. And so eventually, half a year after they got there, my mother and my father decided to get married or whatever.
And I think you say in the book that they had you pretty soon after their experience during the war.
Yes, it was. Yeah. It was quite common. I mean, okay. My parents would never have married in any other circumstance except the Holocaust. You know, and a lot of, I mean, there are plenty of stories in the DP camps of people marrying inappropriate partners because they basically needed to rebuild. They had this need to rebuild. And I have a poem about that. It's called Renewal. It's actually an allegory that talks about this. Jerusalem after the snow, almond trees blanketed in frost. I watch their branches swirl in the gust, showering petals to the ground that could not hold fast. It is cruel to bloom in the winter when one's sap is turgid and sour, exposing small translucent blossoms just born to the shivering sleet. What fruits will be brought forth from these? Thick-husked and bitter, no doubt. And when stillness comes, of what do these blossoms dream? Of warm summer breezes and shimmering red flowers, and hummingbirds craning their sparkling neck to sip of their fragrant nectar, perhaps. But theirs is to bloom while the hummingbirds sleep, impelled by some impassive force of nature, bent on renewal, to put forth these tiny pale flowers in the midst of a maelstrom. So I really feel that my parents were not psychologically ready to have a family, but that they were so bent on renewal and rebuilding, and the trauma caused them to want to make something, to have a family after their entire family was destroyed. Mm-hmm. They needed the family or whatever, you know. So it's sort of sad, you know, that you have these kids, but you're not really able to take care of them the way you should.
Yeah, but after so much loss, there was that need to rebuild, or even maybe fill in the gaps or the spaces that were left behind.
Yeah. But because my parents never spoke, at a certain point in my life, you know, when you grow up in a family, you don't know really if it's a good or a bad family. You have no comparison or whatever, you know. And especially since my parents tried very, very hard to be normative, you know, and so you sort of feel that, you know, you feel like a failure because you were born in order to fill the vacuum that the Holocaust left in you, and you could never fill it because that's not how one, you know, you don't, healing from trauma comes from within and not from something outside. So I could never really satisfy my parents or whatever and their traumas or whatever, but you felt that you had to, and you failed. But you don't really feel that your family is different until later on. And at a certain point, you know, I started reading about second generation. And I read that in order to heal, you have to connect to the past, you know, and connect to history. But my parents never spoke, so I had no way of connecting to my past. And so that was a lot of my impetus. That's the other impetus of the poetry, is to create memory, you know, and because I tried to create a narrative out of the silence in order to process the trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, and so during your life, you really felt like there was a pressure on you to fill that emotional space that your parents had.
I felt that there was an emptiness, and that there was a need, and we were born in order to heal them, you know. And but you can't really, you know. My mother was never satisfied with what I. You know, with what I did, and you know, because I'm religious and I'm very steeped in the Jewish tradition, you know, a lot of my references are to the Torah, to the Bible, and in the Bible there's this story of Joseph and Pharaoh, and Joseph is brought to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And and the story is that Pharaoh sees 7 cows coming out of the Nile that are very fat and wonderful cows, and then 7 more cows come up out of them who are skinny and emaciated, and the skinny cows eat the fatted cows, but then, you know, the cows remain as skinny as they were before, and they ate this gigantic cow, and yet they're still skinny. And so I used this as a metaphor for my parents not being ever really satisfied with me. You know, I am part of a war on Pharaoh's cows. I am part of a war unfinished, a war that can never be finished, for its corpse remain unburied, its dead unmourned. I am a character in a narrative never told, a syllable in a secret left unwhispered, its message conveyed in silence and robed in secrecy. I spent my life peering into the chasms of your needs. Hunger's unsated, hunger's never to be sated, like Pharaoh's cows, a voracity that devours fatted heifers, ever gone. You know, so that affects your self-esteem, because, you know, you want to be cherished. And in some ways, my parents, I was very important for my parents, and I was cherished, and they wanted me. But on the other hand, they were disappointed. I felt I was a disappointment to them. So there's this paradox. And in some ways, it's easier for a child to deal with neglect or to deal with, you know, being spoiled than to have this paradox, you know, where it goes from one side to the other, where you feel wanted and then you feel like you're not worthwhile. And so there's this paradox that affected me and affected my self-esteem.
You mentioned that your parents, you know, never spoke of what they went through, and I think that's a pretty common theme for a lot of people who either went through that themselves or grew up as children of survivors. But do you recall if, I guess during that time period, if there was like ever any kind of, you know, resources or things available for these people? Because it seems like the crux of the healing has really fell on the second generation to talk about these things, to relay those stories.
There wasn't much knowledge about trauma then, and you know, there wasn't much help available for Holocaust survivors. It's only like in the past, you know, 40 years that there's, and by, 40 years ago, my parents were well into their, into their 50s or whatever, it's not the time where you start, it's already, your kids were out of the house and everything like that. So it's, it was important to them to try to be as normal as possible, to repress it, to say that we're a family like every other family, and we weren't, and there was a lot of trauma, but it's quite common in traumatic families that they try to hide the trauma, and they say, people are abused, and they say, oh, where'd you get that bruise? And I say, oh, I fell down the stairs, and things like that, So you try to be normal. So I tried to be normal for 45 years or whatever. And then I realized that I'm not going to get better unless, I look for the roots of the problem. And the roots of the problem is the Holocaust trauma. And I have to deal with that. And I have to create a memory in order to mourn, because mourning is the way you deal with trauma.
And it's in different poems in the book, you talk about that specifically. And that's something that's really struck me when I've been doing these interviews with different people, especially if they've gone during the war, if they went somewhere to avoid what was happening, or they got out early and they come back and there's just no one from their families left. And I know in several of your poems, you talk about seeing pictures of your aunts and uncles as children, or just kind of maybe wondering like who some of these relatives were that you had at some point. And there was, I guess, the kind of that discovery phase you went through where you were really questioning, who these people were, like what is this background I belong to? Yes. And there was, you obviously had different ways of dealing with that. Yeah. But
So if I could show the cover of my book or whatever, these are all members of my family. Okay. And this is my father as a child and his brother, and this is my mother over here, and over here. Pictures from either right before the war or after the war. And sometimes we're just given names, that's all I know or whatever. And there was a need for me to feel that I had a family or whatever, And so basically I wrote a few poems that, one of them is names. Because I feel it gives me satisfaction every time I read this poem, because it's what I can do to mourn my grandfather Mordechai Kleinbart. I don't even have a picture of him. All I have is his name. And I use poetry and fiction to create someone, and through giving him various sort of names, by giving him because I think that part of living life is gaining nicknames. I'm sure you know that or whatever. You probably have quite a few, nicknames on your own.
Over the years, yeah.
Yeah, so over the years,
some good, some bad.
Yeah, no, of course, but that, that shows that you lived because you have all these nicknames. You become, you're a son. Your brothers give you nicknames, and your friends in high school give you nicknames. So that I just had a single name, Mordechai Kleinbart, meant that I didn't know who he was. I had no idea who he was. And so I created someone, I created through the names someone. And so I just want to say that the word for father in Yiddish is tati. And the diminutive is tatele. So that will explain a little bit about some of his nicknames. My mother's father's name was named Mordechai Kleinbart. The baby, because he was the eldest son, his mother called him Tatele, little father. And his father probably called him Mordechai, as my father called me. That's my Hebrew name, is Mordechai. Martin is Mordechai. His sister and his brother called him perhaps Moti, except for the baby sister who called him Momo, even after she grew up. His wife's cousins at the winery may have called him Kleiny, and his children surely called him Tati, as did his wife, except late at night, alone in the bedroom, she would maybe call to him with Yiddish familiars in a soft, erotic lilt. Or maybe not, because Mordechai Kleinbart is the single name I have, and it alone is carved into stone and molded into bronze. All other names exist only in memories long interred, or on pages yet unwritten. You know, so the experience of writing poetry, and also the visiting Poland made the whole idea of the Holocaust real. I mean, the only real time that I you know, you can see I'm a little bit teary now, but the only time I really broke out into sobs was in Auschwitz, because in Auschwitz they have this large headstone, and they say that on this headstone it says that here is buried the dust of the victims, you know, because they put them in the crematorium, so all that left was dust, and the dust they get buried in the ground, and there's this place that's a mass grave. It's only the dust, and that's where my family is buried, and that was the place where I really felt the first time that I'm encountering my family, and this is you know, the encounter allows grieving. Ergo sum, the relatives who died in the war have faded in and out of our lives, not alive, not even a little bit alive, but then not dead, gone or lost in the war, maybe once or twice mentioned as dead or killed, but this is stated with such dispassion that it seems not true. So I'm going to Auschwitz to give them life, to find them within the ledgers and the lagers, within the piles of shoes, within the ashes. For you cannot be destroyed unless you were once alive. So within the desolation I will prove their existence. Like a later date Descartes, you were killed, therefore you were, and I will grieve.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a really incredible thing to, as much as you want to say that, to be there at that place and to find that connection with the people you're related to.
Yeah. You know, so it's not easy to grieve for someone who you've never met, you know, never given you a hug, you know, and is never spoken about, you know. Yeah. So I would, you know, later in the years, you know, what I had in the beginning, you know, when I would ask questions, she refused to do it because I said, I'm not going to be able to sleep if I talk about the Holocaust, if I talk about my family. But later in the years, when I was in my, you know, 50s, and, you know, I became much more, you know, much more courageous. You know, I probably had less mercy on my mother because I knew that time was short and that if I didn't ask a question, you know, I wouldn't know. You know, but she would give, you know, laconic answers. You know, she wouldn't say anything about it. You know, I say, oh, tell me about your grandfather. I expect her to talk, you know, a half an hour about her grandfather because she grew up in the whole same town as he did, you know, and she spent every Sabbath, you know, they had dinners together and everything like that. You know, she would talk about him and tell me about him, you know, so, but she said like a single sentence, mince. When I asked about her grandfather, my mother said he gave his grandchildren mints, then silence. Not if the mints were azure blue or pinwheel red or white. Not the peppery scent of their breaths, not of the toddler's cries because he would not get, just mints. It is left for me to imagine my uncles crunching impatiently the hard candy when they tired of letting it dissolve, as I would a generation on.
When I read that one, I thought that one was particularly poignant because, like you said, she's not talking some, you know, memory she had as a child when she did something or spent time with the grandfather, but just something very disconnected that she recalled.
But then my act of identifying that I'm saying, oh, they must have crunched the candies because I crunched the candies.
Right.
It's my way of identifying myself with them. And even though I don't know if it's true or whatever, but I have this need to identify with them in order to feel that those are my uncles.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you were starting this project, is that when you kind of really decided that it was time to sit down and really press your mother and your parents about who these people were?
No, the only way I know about the Holocaust is through my aunt's testimony. She gave testimony, which is very valuable to me, because a lot of what I know is just through her testimony. But when I was 40 years old, I said I wanted to, get in touch with my roots, and I joined then a listserv. There weren't even Google groups then. It was a email listserv where we sent emails back and forth.
This was in the 90s.
This was in the 90s. Yeah. There was on Shamash a 2G, a second generation group, and we would discuss all our problems and what we inherited and the intergenerational trauma. And at the same time I was starting to read, Dina Vardy has a book called The Memorial Candles, very much influenced me. And as a result of the discussions, I would raise so much emotions to me that I would answer on the group via poetry. And so I wrote, a bunch of poetry about, connecting to the Holocaust and also about our trauma. And that's how I started writing poetry.
When you write poetry, do these poems, do they just come to you in a way, or is it a process where you're kind of writing it down and honing it and kind of chiseling it into the finished work? Or is it more of
it's very interesting. Most of my poems, I would go to work, and then in the evening I would log on and read the emails and answer them, and then I would go to sleep, and then I would wake up like dawn or 4 o'clock in the morning, because my mind was so busy with it. And it was at the junction of the conscious and the subconscious that most of my poems would come to me, or whatever. So I would, basically I would, lay there thinking and writing my poems, and then I'd wake up and write them, and then, you have to polish the poems afterwards and everything like that. But most of my poems were written like in bed, thinking about it. There are other situations where I was very emotionally moved that as a result, later on I would write poetry. But, very often your psyche needs time to digest it, You're too overwhelmed at the time when you're being moved, but, slowly your mind learns to process it, and then you're able to write it down.
It's a bit of an exhausting process trying to process and recover from trauma.
I found it empowering. The whole idea of writing poetry and the creative process. I mean, it's one of the gifts that the human being is given, his ability to create words or create film, or to make something out of So the idea that I'm able to write and to move other people is incredibly empowering for me. It's part of the healing process, is that empowerment, because I felt so weak and so, lack of self-esteem, and so, not worthwhile, that this whole idea of creating, and just putting my work out there. So, it's amazing just at the symposium, people coming up to me and saying, because when you live with yourself, you're in your, you don't realize that, you do something that can affect other people.
Right. Yeah. And I think, I know one of the things I get is I see these kinds of works and people sharing their stories, and real act of courage, and it kind of tells me, hopefully tells other people, that if these folks can, stand up and deliver their testimony and their experiences in such a, well-articulated manner, then I think that hopefully would encourage other people to confront whatever things they've gone through in their lives, to also go on that experience of trying to heal from it, and to maybe, as in your case, produce something out of it that other people can glean from, and it kind of, is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense.
Yeah. Another thing that I want to do is that the language of remembrance of the Holocaust is very ideological, very didactic, and it's difficult for the younger generation to connect to a language that's so traumatic and so didactic and so ideological. And so that's part of the reason why I write poetry, is that there be a more personal and more emotional language. And that's the, I have a poem that's called Dreams. It's a very short poem that talks about this idea of healing, and to try to find a more emotional language that can connect future generations to the Holocaust. Dreams. Everyone seems to have their lessons from the Holocaust, except for me. I only have the dead, who I try to extract from my mother's nightmares into my dreams. So I don't talk about ideology. I don't say, what can we learn from the Holocaust? And, should we, talk about anti-Semitism, or should we talk about human rights or democracy, the anti-fascism? I don't use the Holocaust as an ideological platform in order to try to push for things. I talk about mourning. I talk about trauma. I talk about healing. I talk about compassion. And that's what I want to come out of the Holocaust. I think that there's a lack of seeing the other. I think that we're very divided in this country and in Israel also, and that we don't see the other. There's red states and there are blue states, and there shouldn't be those sort of divisions. Ideology shouldn't divide us or whatever, because and so we're human beings, and so I think that there's a lack of compassion. I think when the red states talk about the blue states, and the blue states talk about the red states, there's a total lack of compassion. And that's what I want to see come out of the Holocaust, not an ideology, this is the way to be and that's the way to be. I want us to be more compassionate.
I think in this country, I don't know who coined the term, but there's definitely a politics of pain, where people will vote for one party or the other because of what they might inflict on people they don't agree with. But when you talk about the younger generation and what you want to convey to them, I think that's a very powerful message, because just going here to the university, this whole these issues, especially as it relates to what you hear in the news and people's different opinions on Israel and Palestine or whatever, that might be. But I think you have a unique experience because you grew up in the United States, right? You were born in Chicago, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you lived I think you said you lived between there and New York City for a number of years.
Some years in Los Angeles. Yeah.
In Los Angeles. And you currently live in Israel, where you've been for several decades?
Yeah.
Okay. I kind of like to get and we talked a little bit about this over the weekend, but just like to kind of get your perspective as someone who's experienced both cultures and currently lives in a place in the world that you hear so much about on the news. I guess especially just, I don't know, just do you have, when you talk about trying to heal those divides and just really trying to see other people, specifically as people, how do you think that can really relate to, I guess, what we're seeing going on in the world, where you hear about bombings or missile strikes or all these different things that are constantly on, mainstream media?
I think that in Israel, we're talking about a country that has been traumatized. First from the Holocaust, but also the people who came from the Orient, and the Arab lands, also had their trauma of being discriminated against, and we've had wars, and we've had terror for so many years. And the problem with trauma that's unprocessed, and I think in America there's a lot of trauma that's unprocessed, and the problem with trauma that's unprocessed is that when you're traumatized, you focus on your own pain, mm-hmm. and you are unable to see the other and to empathize with the other person's pain. And so I think that what my poetry is trying to do is saying, look, we have all this trauma. We have the trauma of the Holocaust that my parents never tried because no one knew, and they weren't given the help in order to process the trauma. So, let's process, let's find a language that talks about, that's not traumatic language, that's not ideological, that's not screaming, that's more talks about, processing the trauma and compassion and emotions and not ideas. And I think if you process the trauma, you're going to be able to heal the divides because you've got to see the other person. So that's the whole idea of Son of Shoah is to say, okay, there's a different language of the Holocaust. That it's not all about anti-Semitism and hatred and desolation and destruction. Mm-hmm. There's also, there's mourning and caring for the other and processing the trauma. And so that's, I should have a poem here that's called Tears that I'm looking for. Tears. The souls of the dead lie dormant under the filming wrapping of the years in anticipation, like a child who hides beneath a blanket, waits to be discovered. Our cries of protest do not move them, nor do our tears of indignation. They huddle tighter at the bolts of anger. But when we whisper their names and cry tears of longing that they have yet to know, then the warmth of the tear caresses their foreheads, and they blink open their eyes, astonished, and stir themselves, loosening their limbs to fly down to our dreams. I think there's too much language of indignation, of anger, and protest, and that we need more, mourning and tears and empathy in order to heal ourselves.
Absolutely. I thought what you said before was very powerful and got me thinking about something one of our pastors here in town told me. They said that pain makes people narcissists. Mm-hmm, and mm-hmm. I thought that was particularly profound and something really worth thinking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I know even in my own life where I've gone through things, it doesn't, if you have any kind of pain or resentments, it's something that you tend to think about a lot in your mind and you stay in your mind. And I know in my experience, the way I've gotten out of that is really trying to focus not on myself and on other people. And I think doing this kind of work, it's, like you're trying to get across, like it really makes you want to have empathy and compassion and focus on other people's experiences in the world. And you can find a way to build bridges by doing that.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think what's going on in Gaza is terrible. Mm-hmm. And I think that the trauma and the pain of a lot of Israelis from the attack on October 7th keeps them from being, mm-hmm. makes them into narcissists and prevents them from being able to see the pain and the suffering in Gaza because they have so much pain of their own from the October 7th and they're so angry. And so, we need to heal the trauma. Yeah. We need to heal the trauma. There's way too much trauma in this world, and there's way too much divisiveness. And I think that politics, one of the ways they gain their power is via the divisiveness, and we have to realize mm-hmm. that we're being used by politicians
Yes.
to create this divisiveness because that's their way to power. And if we're going to heal the world and we're going to feel better about myself and create a world where there's less suffering, we have to look more towards the empathy and be less narcissistic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to speaking with Dr. Peter Petschauer when we get together, because I wrote a note when he was speaking the other day, or yesterday, that he was talking about dictators and how the way that dictators, or just maybe politicians in general, stay in power is fomenting those feelings of fear and disconnectedness and separateness between different groups.
I definitely see Peter as my partner in what we're trying to do. And that's why I wrote this book, and that's why I traveled all this way from Israel in order to try to create to help process the trauma and to try to create a new way of looking at the Holocaust.
If you don't mind me asking you, one of the things that I guess you told me when we first met that really led you, or I guess more recently in recent years, that led you on this, expedition to maybe be a bit more philanthropic or to, reach out to these kinds of centers, is that you were saying that you had an experience that happened with your son in Israel. Would you maybe mind speaking a little bit about that experience?
2001, we lived in along the coast in Petach Tikva, which was in the center, in the Dan region of near Tel Aviv. And because my son had ADD, attention deficit disorder, there was a special school that was in Samaria, which was, then it's considered the Judea and Samaria, it's the disputed territories, about 40 minutes away from our house, and he was sent there by public transportation, and then he switched to protected buses, because then was the Intifada, and while they were switching buses, a suicide bomber from the Hamas came and blew himself up, and two of the children, the high school students, were killed, and my son lost sight of his eye. In 2008, 74 American families whose family were either killed or injured during the Intifada, second Intifada, joined together to bring a suit against the Arab Bank. And in 2017, I got some money, and my son got money, my wife got money, and my wife and I said, we're comfortable, we're middle class, we don't need this money, it's not really our money, and we decided to donate it towards causes. One of the causes is Holocaust memory and changing the way we remember and the language in which we remember. So I have a book. I started a program called Creating Memory. I have the book over there, where I use the arts as a way of processing the Holocaust memory and educating towards Holocaust in a new way, in a more compassionate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think as far as Holocaust education goes here in the state, maybe even beyond, hopefully people will watch this interview one way or the other.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's something that can really be applied to this area of study, and I think just even be applied throughout the study of history in general. And really, I think as far as journalism goes, I think that's something that we need more of that, because so much of that is just appealing to whatever team people happen to be on.
Right.
As because you had the experience of healing from the experience that your parents went through and the reverberations of that in your own life. Did you go through something similar with your son and that particular experience? Because I can only imagine that, just something you went through, but I could imagine that many situations of people throughout Israel and that region have maybe experienced or something similar, or there's like maybe living in that area, there's a threat of that kind of uncertainty happening, more so there than maybe other places.
If anything, I acted like my parents, and I downplayed the trauma.
Okay.
You know, I said, okay, it's, you know, you lost an eye, you still have another eye, you just move forward. You know, and I don't think if you ask me now, was I traumatized by the act or whatever, I insulated myself from it, you know, because you're saying, you know, it's not so terrible, you know. There was Holocaust that I had, you know, 127, you know, members of my family destroyed, and all this, you know, suffering of my family, you know. This is small potatoes, and I really haven't connected to the trauma of it. I really haven't felt it or whatever, and I think it's. I probably should. I probably should be in a different place, and I probably should have reacted differently then. And now it's a long time ago, so. But I know then is that I definitely deflected the trauma, and you know, it was important to us to move on and carry on or whatever.
Yeah, and maybe that's just the natural way of dealing with these things. I know I've had challenges in my own life, but I've nothing, you know, as serious as that, thankfully. But I think perhaps that is a way that, you know, many of us deal with those experiences in life, and really, maybe it's really not only until years later are you really able to think about it fully.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of poems in my books that it's full of regret of the person that I once was, you know, and that until I healed, I was not, you know, my life wasn't where it should have been, and I wasn't the parent I should have been, and my relationship with my wife wasn't the way it should have been or whatever. And so, yeah, there's a lot. All of us have a lot of regret about our lives, and
Can relate to that.
You're still young. You can repair. You can, you know, in some ways, you know, I started my healing process at you know, age 45, you know, and you sort of think, well, what if I had been in my, you know, 20s or my 30s when I started to heal, you know, how much pain would I have saved myself? How much pain I would have saved my parents? How much pain I would have saved my wife? How much pain I would have saved my children?
Yeah. I know for myself, I went through a divorce about 2 years ago, and that was the impetus for me to really dig into myself and try to find those things that were that could be better, that would have helped me, you know, connect more, be more present, or just more emotionally mature, you know, with that other person. But not to, you know, compare, you know, that whole thing, but it was definitely the impetus for me to grow, and I think if I didn't go through that, I probably wouldn't be able to have the kind of conversations I have with people such as yourself, or the other people here associated with the center. Just having you know, gone through that, it's made me a bit more empathetic. Just having that own experience.
Well,
but it's important to.
The Midrash says that after Moses broke the tablets, he didn't leave them there. That he made a second set of tablets, but he took the broken tablets also with him. And there's something about brokenness. I mean, God creates brokenness in this world. And in some ways, you go through, I as a second generation have gone through terrible pain, but in some ways I see that if I'm able to bring healing to other people, if I'm able to bring compassion, if I am able to affect other people, then, you know, you don't say, perhaps it's worth it. I don't want to say it's worth it. I think that in some ways God, you're one of God's tools in this world. I mean, it's terrible to have gone through a divorce like you did or whatever. But if you're able to say, well, it's part of a process that God works in the world through brokenness or whatever, then, so I can be angry at God, but then I can also realize that somehow, my brokenness is in some ways a gift to the world. And that's what I'm trying to do with my poetry. There's brokenness there or whatever, but I'm trying to do something with the brokenness. And you have brokenness, and you're saying, well, I want to do something with my brokenness. It happened. I mean, we can't go back, and unbreak it, but let me be the person I am after this brokenness and try to use my pain for good.
Yeah, and I like how you refer to the Moses story. Usually when I think of these things, I refer to the book of Job, which is probably one of my favorites. And hey, talk about comparing pain. He went through quite a bit. But people in that story like to point to, oh, well, there at the end, God restored everything to twice the amount that he had lost. But in some ways, as I think about it, I don't really think that's the point of going through something, that you're going to get things back twofold. I think it's more so that you go through things in life, you don't necessarily understand them, but the world is so much bigger than whatever trials or issues or problems you have in your own mind. And I think that's why the importance of getting rid of that narcissistic mentality is so important, because I think in that way God allowed Job to see outside of himself, to see the world as it is. And I think that really connects back to that point of trying to really emphasize the importance of having empathy and compassion for other people in this life, and not to be so self-centered, but to say that I can take this and I can almost put it in the world and give it as a gift to others, and try to be a bit more outwardly minded in that sense.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of ways to think about it, but I know in your book you have a section on theology where you deal with these really deep questions, and kind of like Dr. Boyd was saying the other day, it's just like, some good days, I might be agnostic. On best days, I might, believe, but, on my worst days, I definitely, struggle with it, and that's something I definitely relate to as well.
Well, if faith were easy, you wouldn't get rewarded for being faithful.
It wouldn't be called faith, and that's
exactly. I mean, it's hard to have faith, and it's hard to see God in everything. And I think that you're allowed. I feel I'm allowed to be angry at God.
Yeah.
Because he uses brokenness as a tool. And it's one of his tools in which he creates change in this world is via brokenness. But there's something cruel about it, using brokenness as a tool. So I'm angry at God that he uses my brokenness and my parents' brokenness, and and everywhere we look, there's brokenness that is being used as a tool, and we're supposed to overcome it and make the world better because of the brokenness. And that's the mission. And you can't despair. You have to believe that I can take my brokenness and do something with it that's going to affect others.
Amen to that. Marty Herskovitz, I think that might be a good place to end our discussion. I don't think
I mean, you sent me a whole bunch of questions. I don't think we answered them all, but I think I like how it went so far.
That's good. All right, then. Well, thank you very much.